Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Neda Bellucci, the Executive Director of PAAIA, the Public Affairs Alliance of Iranian Americans. And tonight is an open and important discussion on Know Your Rights. It's in response to two major policies enacted here in the United States. The first is the reinstatement of the travel ban that includes a total ban on Iranians with few exemptions. In this new version, unlike the previous one, students are not exempted, while some religious minorities are. And the second major policy that has swept the country in the past month and severely impacted Iranian Americans is Immigration and Customs Enforcement's arrests following the Israeli 12-day war with Iran and the US bombing of Iranian nuclear sites. In the past month, over 670 Iranians of varying immigration status have been arrested, and scores more, as I have received texts and phone calls, have been asked surprising, invasive, personal, or secondary questions at airports when returning home to the US. With regards to those ICE arrests, undoubtedly most of you know about two cases. The first is that of Manzana Dana Khashanian, where ICE removed her from her New Orleans home as she was gardening. Donna has been living peacefully in the US for over 45 years and has been complying with government officials that she check in with immigration authorities. With major support from her community and the intervention of Representative Steve Scalise, ICE released Donna. And this begs the question, why was she arrested to begin with? You've all also likely heard about the second case of two Iranian Christians in Los Angeles who entered the United States via CPB-1. During that arrest, you may have also have heard an ICE agent say that CPB-1 is no longer allowed. That begs the question, but aren't those who entered through it allowed to be in the United States? And the third case that you may have heard is here in the DC area, where ICE arrested 52-year-old Reza Zavar as he was walking his dog. Here, since he was 12 years old and a green card holder, ICE cited Reza's late 1990s misdemeanor marijuana possession as the reason for his arrest, detention, and possible deportation to Romania or Australia. Here with us tonight to try and understand and how you might protect yourselves or those you care about, and these three cases that we've talked about, are Abdi Soltani and Kia Hamandanchi. Both are with the ACLU. Abdi is the executive director of the ACLU of Northern California since 2009. And since the 1990s, Abdi has been a civil rights advocate helping transform California from a state that led attacks on civil rights to a state that has been at the forefront of advancing equality. And Kia is a senior federal policy counsel at the ACLU National. Prior to joining the ACLU, Kia worked at the Peace Street Project and the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center. He's also served as an oversight counsel on the House Education and Labor Committee and a staff member in the U.S. Senate under Senators Tom Harkin and Sherrod Brown. It's my pleasure to welcome both of you this evening. Before we do begin to be properly legal about it, as we are discussing Know Your Rights and what is happening with the arrests and detentions, this evening is not a substitute for a lawyer or serves as legal advice. It is a general understanding of what is happening. And so I want to make sure that for everyone watching and participating, that if you do have questions or something should happen to you, you will need local legal counsel. And with that, I want to really turn things over to Abdi and Kia so we can get started.
Thank you, Neda. I'm going to talk a bit about the ACLU and kind of some of our national work over the last 6 months before I turn it over to Abdi, who's going to talk more about the Know Your Rights specifics. I'm Kia Hamandanchi. I am a senior policy counsel with the ACLU National based in Washington, D.C. I primarily work on national security and surveillance related issues. The ACLU is this kind of, so first of all, the ACLU has been around since about 1920. And there are three major components, I would say. The first is the National Political Advocacy Department, which is what I work in, which deals primarily with policy. So what's coming out of administration, what's coming out of Congress. The second is our legal department, which is mostly based in New York, and is basically the department that takes on all the cases that come across our docket. So anything to do with immigration, anything to do with free speech rights, anything to do with national security rights is handled out of that. And the third component is the state affiliates, of which I believe there are 54. I think there's one for every single state, but some states like California have multiple affiliates. Like, I think with California actually has three. And so that's kind of like just an overview of kind of the ACLU and how it's structured. And so last fall, in preparation in advance of the presidential election, we prepared a series of memos going through the plans of both presidents, both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, basically going through everything they said during their campaign and how we would plan to respond to the civil liberties concerns raised by both their platforms. Obviously, Donald Trump won the election. So the Kamala Harris memos there, I don't think are any on our website any longer, but you can go to the ACLU website. And for pretty much anything that the Trump campaign said, or it was in Project 2025 or anything like that, there's a response plan from the ACLU. And those are all on our website. You can go look at that. And this is kind of, we laid out exactly what we were expecting and how we plan to respond. And my sense is that, well, there's been a lot of things that have been unprecedented in the last 6 months. Most of them were also somewhat anticipated, and I think that's reflected in the memos, and that's on the ACLU's website. The second thing we did is we have put together a program called Firewall for Freedom, and that's working with our state affiliates to essentially what are things that they can do to push back against the current administration and the policies, and to the extent that it threatens civil liberties. And so that's kind of menu of policy options that have gone out to all our state affiliates. And obviously each state affiliate is differently situated and each state law is different. And so that is kind of a toolkit for them to work with on the state level to try to serve, I think, as a firewall for the actions coming from Washington, D.C. And so just to flag some of the issues that we've been working on kind of from the policy side, or also litigating on, that you may be familiar with, pretty much anything to do with ICE, the immigration policy of this administration. More recently, I think we've been focused on the use of face masks by ICE detention, basically the fact that ICE detention are wearing masks, not identifying themselves, and what are some policy options to try to push back on that. The second, something that's been a particularly big area of work for the ACLU has been the deportation of students for exercising their free speech rights. I believe we've been involved. We've litigated quite a few of these cases, and we've been involved in almost every single case where this has happened. And I think, and I have to confirm this, but pretty much everyone we were involved with, the people were able that our client was able to be released from detention in those cases. The most prominent one being obviously Mohammed Khalil, who was in D.C. Today and yesterday, meeting with members of Congress. Another area has been the use of the Alien Enemies Act, which is a wartime authority that came around during the War of 1812 and was used, I believe, in World War I and World War II, which is one of the tools that the Trump administration has been using to try to speed up deportations without due process. And so there's been a lot of litigation that we've been involved with in that. Another area is kind of deployment of military within the U.S. for non-military purposes. An example of that is some of the stuff we've seen in LA in the last month or so, where Trump called the Marines, where they called the National Guard against the will of the governor. Something else that has been a longstanding issue for the ACLU, in which we've seen at various points in the Trump administration, is border device searches. So essentially, when you cross over the border, in some instances, the CBP is trying to search people's devices when they cross over. We have litigated in various contexts that's a violation of the Fourth Amendment, but the case law on that remains somewhat unsettled. A few other things: abuse of emergency powers. Most of the underpinning what's happened in the Trump administration is because they have abused emergency powers in a lot of spaces, and I think that's something we very much have pushed back on. More recently, we sent a letter to Trump on the War Powers Act. The ACLU has a longstanding position that the president cannot exercise military force without the approval of Congress. So in advance, before the strikes of Iran, we sent a letter to Trump, which obviously he didn't respond to, saying that whatever you want to do here, you need the approval of Congress, which is a position that we've taken under presidents of both parties. going back for basically since Vietnam. And in the aftermath of strikes, we've been really tracking, I think, to extent, there was a lot of talk from the administration of like sleeper cells and all sorts of things like that. And we've been tracking to make sure that they aren't ramping up various things like watch listing or going after Iranians on discriminatory grounds in kind of the wake of those strikes. Social media monitoring is another important area that we've been keeping an eye on, particularly the use of AI tools, because this is fueling a lot of this seemed to be fueling a lot of the decisions they were making in terms of trying to deport students for their speech. Building on that, just the expansion of tools like facial recognition and AI to further the administration policy is a pretty big area for us. And kind of the last thing I want to flag that we've been really focused on is you've seen the combining of a lot of databases within the government. So you've seen ICE is getting access to tax data, ICE has been getting access to Medicaid data, something that's very concerning. And like I think there's like the extent that the government has a lot of information on people, and to the extent they start combining that, and we're concerned about the possibility of the government having essentially a dossier on every single American, and so that's something that's been a big and growing area of concern as the Trump administration has continued. But that kind of gives you a broad overview of what we've been doing a national over the last 6 months or so. But I'll turn it over to Abdi, who will talk about Know Your Rights.
Great. Thank you so much, Kia. There's a small cohort of Iranian American staff at ACLU, and each of us has different roles. I'm the executive director at ACLU Northern California, and as Kia introduced himself and as Neda welcomed us both, Kia works for the national ACLU, whereas I work for the ACLU of Northern California. I just want to begin by saying a big word of thanks and congratulations to PAAIA. I've been connected to PAAIA since just after its founding. I've admired the organization, and I just want to say it takes a lot to build, grow, and sustain an organization as you all have. And so I just want to thank you for all of your programs. And I also will say yours is one of my absolute favorite logos, spelling PAAIA in the Persian script. And also to with the torch image that it brings. So with that said, I wanted to kind of turn my attention to the presentation, but I, for a moment, just need to tell one of my coworkers to stop Teams chatting me because I am in a presentation. Okay. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to this presentation, and I'm going to share my screen. It'll take me a moment, 1 quick second. Okay. Okay. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes.
But you're seeing it probably in slideshow. Great. Okay, are we in slideshow format now? Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to be sharing some general Know Your Rights information from the ACLU. Neda said this at the beginning, this is not legal advice and it does not substitute for consulting an attorney. And at the end of the presentation, I'll go over a number of resources that are available to you for reading further and for following up. And I also want to just say when we were preparing this, Neda sent us a list of many different kinds of legal questions that Iranian Americans or others might have, and it's just not possible to answer all of them or to cover every topic. So we've picked some of the most general topics, and we can just kind of go from there. But we will point you to resources that you can review further to get into specifics. So I'm going to start with a number of things that are just basic, then we'll focus quite a bit on immigrants' rights, and then I'm going to focus on your kind of rights to free speech and to protest and our First Amendment rights. So there's just some very basic principles and basic rights that every person in the United States, regardless of their immigration status, has some basic rights. First is the right to not incriminate themselves. And that includes the right to remain silent and to not answer questions. There's the right to refuse searches of your body, home, or belongings, and the right to not be arrested or detained without a valid reason. And you also have the right to record your interactions with law enforcement. So these are some basic rights, and we'll get into them with a little bit more detail as we go. And one thing too, as Kia alluded to, part of what's happening right now is that this administration is pushing the limit and beyond on some of the statutes and laws, and far exceeding them, and also stretching far beyond the Constitution as well. So we're going to share with you information about our rights, but it doesn't mean that these don't get violated. That's the whole point. And you have to know your rights in order to protect them, but also to document them, and in those situations. So on the right to remain silent, you have the right to remain silent and to speak with a lawyer before you sign anything. And if you wish to exercise your rights or the right to remain silent, you can say it out loud, and you don't need to give an explanation or excuses. You're not required to discuss immigration or citizenship status with police, immigration agents, or other officials. In some states, you must provide your name to law enforcement if you're stopped and told to identify yourself. But even if you give your name, you don't have to answer other questions. And these resources, when you want to get into state by state, will be available through some of these links. Any information given to ICE could be used against you. So one of the things I like to do when I do a training, even when it's like this over a webinar, is just to pause for a second and to say and practice. If you want to exercise your right to remain silent, just practice saying it. I am exercising my right to remain silent. And you can just say that and just practice it. All right, so I gave you a chance to do it. And it's good to just say these things now when you're not in a stressful situation, so that then when you are in that situation, you've had the practice of those words leaving your lips. Okay, next we're going to talk about searches and arrests. You have the right not to consent to a search of your person or your belongings. And agents do not have the right to search you without your consent or what's called probable cause. So agents must have facts that make it probable that an individual is committing or has committed a violation of immigration or federal law. Police may pat down an individual's clothing if they suspect the individual is carrying a weapon. And you have the right to walk away if you're not being arrested or detained. One of the questions you can ask is, are you free to leave? And if you do ask that question, and if they say that yes, you are free to leave, then you can walk away calmly. So this is another one of those phrases that is just good to practice. So just practice after I say it. Am I free to leave? So just practice saying that to yourself on the privacy of your computer, wherever you're sitting. Am I free to leave? Next, we're going to talk about documentation. US citizens do not have to carry proof of citizenship if they are in the United States. Non-citizens who are over 18 must carry their immigration papers with them at all times, and if requested by an immigration agent, they must show their documentation. If a person does not have documentation, they have the right to remain silent and consult with a lawyer before answering any questions, which is what we already just talked about. So let's talk about some of the different places you might be. So public spaces are one space where we are out and about in public, and anyone, including ICE agents, can enter public areas without permission. Public areas include a parking lot, a lobby, or a waiting area. ICE agents may take photographs in public spaces. And being in a public area does not give ICE the authority to stop or arrest just anyone. And that's been a big subject of the situations in Los Angeles and outside of Bakersfield and in other parts of the country where ICE has been just stopping people and arresting people in public spaces. So just because the public area does not give ICE that authority to stop and arrest just anyone. Okay, so now we're going to talk about private spaces. No one can enter a private area without permission or a judicial warrant. So here's a tip, is to show that some areas are private, you can mark them with a private sign, keep the doors closed or locked, and have a policy that the public cannot enter those areas without permission. So this is something that would obviously be your home, but it could also be like a place of business or a community organization that can demarcate what areas are public or private within that space. If ICE arrives, you can ask why they are there and ask to see their badge or identification. If ICE agents try to enter a private area, you could say, this is a private area. You cannot enter without a judicial warrant signed by a judge. Do you have a judicial warrant? So we'll pause on this one too, and you can practice saying, do you have a judicial warrant? And I'll give you a moment to practice saying that because it's hard to ask these questions even now, let alone when there's someone at your door.
Abdi, can I interrupt you very quickly?
Sure.
A lot of the cases that I think everyone has been hearing about and in particular seeing on video are in public. Do you surmise, is it possible that some of these or more of these are happening in public because judges are not signing off on arrest warrants?
That's a great question. And when we start to observe this type of practice and when the ACLU files a lawsuit, as we have in places like Los Angeles or Bakersfield, then we go into a process of discovery to try to understand, like, well, why are they doing this? Because it is so unlawful. In general, when law enforcement has probable cause and specific information and goes to a judge for a warrant, the judge will generally tend to grant that. There are reasons why a judge might not. But in general, when law enforcement has probable cause and specific information, the process is usually one where the judge will issue a warrant. Now, I'm making that as a gross generalization. I think as far as the conduct that we've seen, especially as the incidents that I've talked about, the cases that the ACLU has filed so far, we're observing that they are stopping people usually based on their appearance or their color of their skin or what kind of job or occupation they're in. If they're day laborers or farm workers or a car wash worker, and then using that as a pretext and then proceeding with violating people's Fourth Amendment rights by proceeding without a warrant and the like. So this brings us to a judicial warrant. So a judicial warrant, such as for an arrest or for search, must be signed by a judge, and it'll say U.S. District Court or a state court at the top. Businesses can establish a protocol that instructs staff to elevate ICE requests to a designated person within that business who can inspect the warrant, make a copy, and determine whether it's valid. And it's important to read the warrant carefully to make sure it is valid. So even if the officer has a warrant, individuals have the right to remain silent and speak to a lawyer before answering any questions. And then there's something a little bit different, quite substantially different, called an administrative warrant. Sometimes ICE agents try to use an administrative warrant, such as a warrant for the arrest of an alien or a warrant of removal/deportation to enter. But an administrative warrant does not allow agents to enter private areas without permission. Administrative warrants say things like Department of Homeland Security and are on forms I-200 or I-205. So when ICE shows an administrative warrant with someone's name on it, you do not have to say if the person is there, and you do not have to take ICE agents to the person named on the warrant. So here we want you to see the difference between a judicial warrant versus an immigration warrant. The judicial warrant is the one that's on the left. It says United States District Court. And in this instance, it's for the Eastern District of California. And then it'll have an address, and you have to check the address. Is this the correct address? You'll see the other note. It says only the person, property, and area specified may be searched. You'll see that it has a date that the warrant was issued on or before that it has to be executed. And you have to check the date if it's current. And then look to make sure it's actually signed by a judge. If the answer to all of those questions is yes, then it is likely a valid judicial warrant. On the right-hand side of the screen, what you see is an administrative warrant. And this is the immigration warrant. And you'll see that it's from Department of Homeland Security, and it'll say U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, warrant of removal, deportation. There's no district court. And if this was a local or state criminal matter, you'll see here also there's no state or county court. This is just an administrative warrant. And these are the visual cues that this is an administrative warrant that's different than the judicial warrant we were talking about. So sometimes the way that ICE conducts its enforcement is through a raid. And a raid is when, multiple ICE agents are coming to a given location. So ask everyone to stay calm and to not resist and not to interfere. People should not run to the exits. Running away could give ICE a legal reason to arrest people. Everyone has the right to remain silent and to ask to talk to a lawyer. People should not lie or produce any false documents. If they have a warrant, watch the agents and see if they're complying with what's written in the warrant. If the agents are searching areas not listed in the warrant, you should object to those searches by voicing your objection and noting it. So then again, practicing it, you can just say, I object to this portion of your search, and note it that you did object. So as these ICE raids or other enforcement things are happening, one of the things you can do is to record and write things down. Video recording the agent's actions could be helpful to prove any violations that may occur. If you're in a business or a home that has a camera, you can save any surveillance footage that was taken during the raid. You can also get contact information from witnesses. So here's a couple of important pieces of information to note. Officers' badges and patrol car numbers and which agency they were from. Write those things down. How many agents were present, inside and outside? How were the agents dressed? How were they armed? Did the agents make people believe that they could not move or leave? And did the agents mistreat anyone? And if yes, how? All of this is useful information to write down, either in real time or as soon as you can. Now we're going to talk about if people are arrested and detained. So if ICE arrests anyone, ask the agents where the person is being taken. This information will help loved ones find that person. You may also ask ICE agents permission to obtain from a detained person the contact information of anyone who should be informed of the person's detention, such as a family member, friend, or attorney. If the person being detained authorizes you to do so, you may provide all the information obtained from ICE agents to the friend or family member that they identified. So then we get to the stage of the rights for people who are detained. People detained by ICE have the right to consult with a lawyer, but the government is not required to provide one. The person can ask for a list of free or low-cost alternatives. But unlike the criminal justice system where the government has to provide a lawyer for people who can't afford it, the government is not required to do so just for immigration purposes. Remain silent and not discuss your immigration status with anyone but their lawyer. So we really want to remind people that they have that right. We've said this multiple times. You have the right to remain silent and to not discuss your immigration status with anyone but the lawyer. And they don't have to answer questions about where they were born, whether they are US citizens, or how they entered the country. If you're detained by ICE, you do have a right to a local phone call and to notify your consulate of the detention. So we're going to step back now and talk about how can individuals prepare. Make a plan and discuss it with your loved ones. Memorize the phone numbers of your emergency contact and your lawyer. If you have one, share your immigration number, which is an A number, and give it to your emergency contact. That helps your loved ones locate you. Keep a copy of your immigration documents with someone you trust. Make emergency plans if you have children or take medication, and of course, know your rights. And here it also presumes that you would, take steps to have a lawyer in advance rather than just trying to get a lawyer after the fact once you've become detained or once the person's become detained. Organizations can also prepare. So some of you who are listening today, you might work in a business or a nonprofit, and those organizations can also prepare. Make a written response plan. Practice, just like you do for a fire drill. You'll be more prepared if everyone knows what to do or say. Avoid asking for or collecting information about immigration status. Before booking a space, ask for the business's policy and hold events in places that don't allow ICE in without a valid judicial warrant. And again, know your rights. So we've covered a whole list of topics related to immigration. And now I want to switch and talk a bit more about your First Amendment rights. And these include your right to protest. So your right to protest is a fundamental right guaranteed by the US Constitution and the First Amendment. However, police and other government officials are allowed to place certain restrictions. Law enforcement can monitor protests, enforce laws, and intervene for public safety, but they cannot use excessive force or retaliate against peaceful demonstrators. There's also a variety of issues with respect to interacting with law enforcement, including ICE, police, and the military. Some of this overlaps with some of what we talked about, but I wanted to kind of include this as well. So you always want to remain calm and never physically resist. Keep your hands visible. Law enforcement are not allowed to detain you arbitrarily. If you're stopped, you may ask if you're free to leave. And if the answer is yes, you may calmly walk away, which we talked about before, but this would also be in the case at protests too. There's also issues related to documentation and masking. As I mentioned before, in some states, you must provide your name to law enforcement if you're stopped and told to identify yourself. Adult immigrants with green cards or valid immigration visas are required to carry their immigration documents with them at all times. And depending on your state, you may be subject to laws that prohibit wearing a mask. So these are all, the first and the third bullet are things to look at on a state-by-state basis. The middle bullet is nationwide. If you're arrested by the police, you have the right to remain silent until speaking with a lawyer. You have the right to make a local phone call. Police are not allowed to listen if you're calling your lawyer. If you can't afford an attorney, you will be appointed one on your court date. And it's best to post bond as soon as possible so that you don't have to wait in jail while you're awaiting trial or the court proceedings. So please know that here I'm talking about if you're arrested by like your city police or your county sheriff because you were at a protest and if you were involved in civil disobedience or if they were to illegally arrest you, these types of arrests are different than the immigration ones I was talking about before. Here you do have a right to an attorney that if you can't afford it, the government would appoint you one. If you're detained by immigration, you have the right to consult with a lawyer, but the government is only required to provide you one if you're criminally charged in under some other criminal law. And otherwise, you can ask for a list of free or low-cost alternatives. Again, remain silent and not discuss your immigration status with anyone but your lawyer. You have the right to the local phone call, and you can notify your consulate of your detention. So now if you witness an individual arrest, document your physical positioning. If you're able and the person being arrested welcomes your support, record their name, date of birth, emergency contact information, any medical information, their gender identity, and write out a full description of the arrest and share that with their emergency contact if they give it to you. There's also information that you can share. You have the right to talk about and publicize truthful information you obtain lawfully, including about what officers are doing and where they're doing it. And you have the right to tell people their legal rights. So these are your First Amendment rights, and they're useful whether what's happening is unfolding at a protest or if you're observing immigration enforcement raids or other actions like those. So I want to go to a topic of videotaping law enforcement. So we talked before about collecting information, writing notes and things like that. And I want to say a little bit more about videotaping law enforcement. When you are lawfully present in any public space, you have the right to photograph anything in plain view, so long as you don't interfere with the law enforcement officials' performance of their duties. And law enforcement may not confiscate or demand to view your photos or videos without a warrant, nor may they delete your data under any circumstances. On private property, the owner may set rules about photography or video. So the First Amendment typically protects the right to record images and video images. The legality of recording audio without someone's consent, though, may depend on the state. So that's something to look up state by state. Okay, so now stepping back and kind of recapping some of what we've talked about. If your rights are violated, write down everything you remember, including the officer's badge, patrol caller numbers, the agency they worked for, get contact information for witnesses, take photographs of any injuries or damages. You can file a written complaint with the agency, and you can also contact the local ACLU in your state or another civil rights or community organization that you trust. So I'm going to just kind of wrap up this section by just walking you through a variety of resources that are available to you. First, I want you to just know that the National ACLU website at aclu.org, Know Your Rights, has pages upon pages of Know Your Rights information about all kinds of situations. For example, Kia talked about at the border, at airports, laptop searches and device searches at airports, all kinds of situations. You can find those at aclu.org, Know Your Rights. At that national ACLU website, our Know Your Rights information tends to cover rights that are basically the same nationwide, and that gives you a good overview of those rights, either with respect to the national government or under the Constitution that apply everywhere. But every state in the country has different laws. And in each state, the ACLU website has additional Know Your Rights information specific to that state. For example, today I've talked about how some states might require you to give your name to an officer and others might not. Or some states it may be legal to record sound without permission of the person, and others it may not be. Those are the types of things that will vary state by state under state law. There's also big differences in state law about whether your local police and sheriff or to what extent they can cooperate with immigration. Those are things that are very different state by state. There's also a variety of resources from other organizations, and I won't talk too much about them, but here you see a couple, and these will be available after. I want to highlight the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, ILRC, which has a whole variety of resources, including really useful printable wallet-sized cards in various languages that are called the red cards, which have some of the key tips from a training like this that you can always keep in your pocket. NACASEC also has a really good Know Your Rights app in various languages. I talked before about preparing a plan. Immigrant Legal Resource Center has really good resources for family preparedness plans. So you can find those on the ILRC website in English and in Spanish. So that covers the full scope of my presentation, and I'm gonna find the button to stop sharing. It'll take me a moment. Actually, why don't I keep this up for now, and then we can always go back to another slide if we need to.
Great. Thank you so much, Abdi and Kia. Before I do sort of open it up to see if anyone has questions, I think one of the major questions that people might have, you've talked about individual and family preparedness. And I think that's very helpful in the sense of people have an idea, largely whether whether you're a green card holder or not. I think some of and whether or not you're, the three cases that we've talked about are the precedent right now for people to maybe question themselves or those around them. But how and so the idea of being prepared to an extent is helpful. But in some of these, when you are hearing that people are being arrested and then detained, so for instance, the last person, Reza Zavar, was arrested in Maryland and sent to Texas. Is there a way or some advice that you might be able to give, or and in theory, of course, not legally, in those instances where you end up so far away? Like you talked about how you have a right to a local call. So if you're in Texas, you don't necessarily have a right to call your family because they're not local. The lawyer that you prepared to call, right, as part of the preparedness plan may not be, is no longer part of your local call. And then what do you do if, again, you're in Texas, but you lived in Maryland? Any thoughts in terms of how to prepare for what just seems to be flouting so much of the legal advice and the preparation, and just really the norms that we have, or at least I grew up with, in the legal system? And is that part of the chaos, the planned chaos maybe of sending people so far away from their homes?
Well, a part of the reason I think they're sending them far away is also just to get them in a more favorable venue, because Texas in particular, for instance, being in the Fifth Circuit, they know that they're more likely to get a more favorable judge than they would in Maryland. And I think that's a big part of why we've seen so many of these people being moved to Texas or Louisiana, because they know they can go before the Fifth Circuit, where that they're probably going to get a more favorable ruling than they would elsewhere. I don't know, Abdi, you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question, and I think that that's why in so many of the ACLU's cases, our clients have been moved from New York to New Jersey to Louisiana. And once we're involved with the case, the ACLU has the affiliates in each state that can kind of help kind of shepherd that, but we're not in a position to do that for every person. I think that's where making sure in your family preparedness that people have your information, the immigration number that I referred to, so that then they can find you as quickly as possible, and connect you to local resources in that jurisdiction.
Thank you. And then Bear has a question, and I think it relates also to some of the phone calls that I've gotten from individuals coming back to the country. So I'll put them together. He says, under a 287G compliance with ICE, can a county or city police department ask the public of their, I guess, ask a person in public their citizenship status, for example, while being pulled over for speeding or just by making contact?
That's a question that would be best for us to look up and provide a better answer than what I could say at the top of my head. So I think, Netta, one of the great things that I think PAAIA and especially other Iranian American organizations can be as a resource where we hear the questions and make sure we're disseminating the answers. But at the ACLU website and elsewhere, we can probably find the answer to that question, but I would prefer not to answer it on the spot.
Very good. In terms of, and I was gonna say, like, there's a parallel because we've been hearing this, people coming back through the airports and being asked additional questions. And I know you, and I think you might have taken it down, but some of this was on one of a slide of as you're coming back into the United States, and because particularly for naturalized citizens, and now there is a fear in the community that despite the fact that you're Iranian American and you're a US citizen, at Border Patrol will ask you additional questions because your passport says born, wherever you might be in Iran. So just a reiteration, do you have to ask those questions? Because, for example, one of the things somebody told me is not only were they asked questions about their, I think, father-in-law, but also a second time they came back into the country, they were asked, "Oh, did you go to Iran?" And the person's like, "You know what, my life is a lot easier if I just answer the questions than get detained because I didn't answer the questions. I may have the right to not answer, but it might just be easier." But people do seem to want to know, in theory, can you not answer those questions?
So I posted into the chat like one of those website hubs at the aclu.org, which goes into a whole range of types of questions and types of situations you might encounter at the airport or at a port of entry. And you can kind of think about things in terms of a spectrum. And when you think about like where are we most protected in our rights, when you're in your home or you're in a business, that's like that most private space where they need a warrant even to just get through the door, a judicial warrant, and not just an administrative warrant, as we talked about. And then you kind of move over, and then at the port of entry is a place where, as we're coming and entering and leaving the country, we still have rights. We don't cede all of those rights just because we're at the port of entry, but where there is more authority for the government to ask certain questions. And I would just encourage folks to go and take a look at that section of the ACLU website and see what kinds of questions you might be asked, what kind of questions you might want to be prepared to answer, and how to answer them. It really will depend very much on the topic, but Kia, go ahead.
No, I was just saying it very much will depend on someone's individual circumstances and the circumstances of what they're asking. Just an example, something you'll find on the Know Your Rights on border device searches. If you're a U.S. citizen and you cannot be forced to unlock your device, that cannot be a reason for them to deny entry into the country. If you want to search your cell phone, but they may take your cell phone. Because they do have the right to take and hold your cell phone, but they can't actually, they want to search your device and you say, no, I'm not going to unlock it for you, they cannot deny you entry into the United States for that reason, if you're a citizen. And one of the good things about the link that Abdi put up is that it really does talk about different circumstances, the different rights that you may or may not have, depending on what your personal situation is.
Yeah, and Netta, building on that, like in kind of thinking about that spectrum idea too, is that and building on what Kia said, depending on what the subject is, we all have the same exact rights, regardless of immigration status, regardless of whether we're a citizen or not. And then in some areas, the rights depend if you're a citizen or not a citizen, legal permanent resident or not. And I will just say, I think some of the things that all people should be concerned about, but especially Iranian Americans, is that they are increasing, these denaturalizations. This is a person who's already gotten US citizenship and they're trying to take that away. Then there's people with green cards, and we've seen very aggressive enforcement, like Kia talked about in some of our free speech cases, of people with green cards who were being detained and being moved to deportation. And then obviously there's like student visas, etc. And then for our community, we're all obviously affected by the travel ban, which has some very particular components to it. So it's just to say it's a lot to kind of navigate. And I think just preparing knowing your rights as much as possible is a really key way to go. And then to the extent that a person is in a more vulnerable situation, just being proactive to identify an immigration attorney or identify a local nonprofit immigration services provider. The ACLU is not a general immigration agency nonprofit. We are not a legal service provider that helps large numbers of individuals. We take on the kind of cases that Kia talked about. We can only serve a small number of people, but just to encourage people to try to know your rights as much as possible, and then to identify an attorney in advance so that if you need the attorney, you already have that relationship in place.
Great. Thank you. Along those lines, two organizations that do help both in California, but one is National PAAIA Equality on Immigration, and of course the newly opened Iranian Legal Defense Fund. So both one generally on immigration, but two, the second one for Iranian Americans that help find lawyers. I just wanted to see, because we're coming up on the hour, if there is a question that we might not, if someone has a question, we might not be sending to the Know Your Rights link. And if there's not, then I'm going to thank you both so very much for joining us, for having participated and led this conversation on Know Your Rights and providing those sources. We will go ahead and put those links up on the PAAIA website and send them out as part of an email thanking everyone for joining us tonight. So thank you again, Abdi and Kia. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Neda.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Have a good one.